It was a cold, rainy night when the stranger walked into our cafe. I had been working the late shift, trying to pass the time by wiping down tables and refilling sugar jars. The usual crowd of night owls and insomniacs were scattered around the place, each absorbed in their world. The bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a new customer. But this one was different. I looked up and my heart skipped a beat. The man who walked in was drenched in blood. It soaked his clothes, streaked his face, and dripped from his hands onto the floor. His eyes, however, were calm and clear, as if the blood didn't bother him at all. He walked to the counter and stood there, staring at me. For a moment I couldn't move. I just stared back, my mind racing. Who was he? What had happened to him? Should I call the police? But before I could do anything, he spoke. "I'd like a coffee, please," he said, his voice steady and polite. "And a candy bar." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone. His request was so ordinary, so out of place, given his appearance. Finally, I managed to speak. "Are you okay?" The man gave a small, almost reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said. "It's not my blood." Those words sent a chill down my spine. If it wasn't his blood, then whose was it? I didn't dare ask. Instead, I nodded and went about making his coffee. My hands were shaking as I poured the hot liquid into a cup and handed it to him. Then I grabbed a candy bar from the display and placed it next to the coffee. "Thank you," he said, still calm and composed. He took a sip of his coffee and then picked up the candy bar. He stood there for a moment, looking around the cafe. The other customers were starting to notice him too, their conversations dying down as they took in the sight of the blood-soaked stranger. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling. I watched him through the window as he disappeared into the night, leaving a trail of blood drops behind him. I was left standing there, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back, or for the police to show up asking questions. But neither happened. The customers slowly returned to their conversations, though the atmosphere in the cafe remained tense and uneasy. When my shift finally ended, I couldn't get the stranger out of my mind. I kept replaying the scene over and over, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? Where had he come from? And whose blood had he been covered in? The next day, I scoured the news for any reports of violence or missing persons, but there was nothing. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The only evidence that he had ever been in the cafe was the bloodstains on the floor, which I had scrubbed away as best I could. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of the blood-soaked stranger began to fade, though it never completely left me. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, but the other customers had seen him too. We occasionally exchanged nervous glances, a silent reminder of the night's strange events. Months later, I was working another late shift when a woman walked into the cafe. She seemed normal enough at first until she approached the counter and handed me a small, blood-stained envelope. My heart skipped a beat as I took it from her. "He wanted me to give this to you," she said quietly, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and sadness. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and left, leaving me alone with the envelope. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, stained with blood and written in a hurried, shaky script. It read, "Thank you for the coffee and the candy bar. I'm sorry for any trouble I caused. I had to do something terrible that night, but it was necessary. The blood was from someone who had to be stopped. You won't hear from me again, but know that you helped make the world a safer place." There was no signature, no indication of who the stranger was or what he had done. I stared at the note, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The mystery was far from solved, but at least I had some small measure of closure. I never saw the blood-soaked stranger again, but I often thought about him, especially on cold, rainy nights. The memory of that night remained with me, a constant reminder that the world is full of mysteries, and that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that have no clear ending. It was a cold, rainy Friday night. I had just come home from a long day at work, feeling exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening alone. The house was dark and silent when I stepped inside, the only sound being the rain tapping against the windows. I dropped my keys on the table and kicked off my shoes, grateful to be home. As I walked into the living room, I noticed something strange. A faint smell, like something rotting, lingered in the air, I wrinkled my nose and made a mental note to check the fridge for any spoiled food later. For now, I just wanted to relax. I grabbed a blanket and settled onto the couch, turning on the TV for some background noise. After a few minutes, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was more than just the cold air. It was a feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling persisted. I glanced around the room, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. I decided to ignore it and focused on the TV, but the sense of unease stayed with me. As the night went on, I heard odd noises coming from upstairs. At first, it was just a creak here and there, but soon it became more pronounced, like footsteps. My heart started to race, and I paused the TV, straining to listen. There it was again, a definite thud, followed by a shuffling sound. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a burglar? An animal? I knew I had to find out. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly made my way up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds grew louder as I approached the top of the stairs. I hesitated for a moment, then forced myself to keep going. As I reached the hallway, I saw that the door to the guest bedroom was slightly ajar. A dime light was coming from inside. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open with my foot, shining the flashlight into the room. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, crouched in the corner, was a man. His clothes were dirty and torn, his hair matted and unkempt. He looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes, and I could see that he was shaking. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Confront him? My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I decided to stay calm and try to talk to him. "Why are you here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." I had nowhere else to go. His words tugged at my heart. He looked so pitiful, so broken. Despite my fear, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Tom," he replied, his voice trembling. "I've been living on the streets for months. I found your house, and it was empty. I thought maybe I could stay for a while, just until I found somewhere else." My mind was racing. This man had been living in my house without me knowing. How long had he been here? How had he managed to stay hidden? I took a step closer, trying to understand his situation. "Why didn't you go to a shelter?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "The shelters are full. They turn people away." I was desperate. I stood there, torn between fear and compassion. This man had invaded my home, but he was clearly in need. I didn't know what to do. Should I help him? Call the police? My thoughts were interrupted by another noise, a soft sob. Tom had started to cry. Seeing him like that, so vulnerable, I made a decision. "Okay, Tom," I said softly. "You can stay for the night, but tomorrow we'll figure something out. I can't have you living here without me knowing." Tom looked up at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much." I nodded and backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a strange sense of calm. I had done the right thing, I told myself. I would help Tom find a better place to stay. As I headed back downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just taken a very unexpected turn. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of Tom and what I should do next. It was a dark, cold night when I got the call for a food delivery. I work as a delivery driver for a small restaurant in town. This call was different. The address was far from the town, near the forest. I had never delivered food to that area before. I put the food in my car and started driving. The road was long and empty. There were no street lights, only the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness. Trees lined both sides of the road, their branches reaching out like long fingers. The wind blew through the trees, making eerie sounds. As I drove further, the houses became fewer and the forest became thicker. I checked the address again. It was a house at the edge of the forest. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just another delivery. After driving for what seemed like forever, I saw a small dirt road leading into the forest. The sign had the same name as the address on the order. I turned onto the dirt road. My car bounced over the rough path, and the trees seemed to close in around me. It was so dark that I could barely see a few feet ahead. Finally, I saw a small house at the end of the road. The house looked old and run down. The paint was peeling, and some of the windows were broken. There was a dim light coming from inside. I parked my car and took the food out. As I walked to the door, I noticed how quiet it was. There were no sounds of animals or insects, just the sound of my footsteps on the wooden porch. I knocked on the door. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I felt uneasy. I looked around and saw no signs of life. I decided to leave the food on the porch and go back to my car. Just as I turned to leave, the door creaked open. A tall, thin man stood in the doorway. He had pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He stared at me for a moment before speaking. I handed him the bag, and he took it without saying anything. I turned to leave, but then he gestured for me to come inside. I didn't want to go inside, but something in his eyes made it hard to refuse. I stepped into the house. The inside was just as old and creepy as the outside. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in dust. The air smelled damp and musty. I sat down in a chair in the corner. The man disappeared into another room. I heard him talking to someone, but I couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, he came back with another person. It was a woman, just as pale and tired-looking as the man. They watched me closely as I sat there. The silence was heavy, pressing down on me. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. They offered me some tea, which I accepted. The tea was bitter, and I struggled to finish it. They kept watching me, their eyes never leaving my face. I asked how long they had lived there. The man started talking about the house and the forest. His voice was low and monotone, and I found it hard to concentrate on his words. The woman just nodded along, her eyes never blinking. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. I noticed strange things about the room. There were old photographs on the walls, but the faces were blurred and hard to see. The furniture looked like it hadn't been moved in years. There was a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't move. My heart started to race. I looked at the man and the woman, but they just stared back at me with blank expressions. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The room started to spin, and the edges of my vision began to blur. Suddenly, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, hard floor. The room was dark, and the only light came from a small, flickering candle in the corner. The man and the woman were gone. I struggled to my feet, my head pounding. I felt weak and disoriented. I stumbled towards the door, my heart racing. The door was closed, but not locked. I pushed it open and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was dark and silent. I made my way back to my car, my legs feeling like they could give out at any moment. I got into my car and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I drove back down the dirt road. I didn't look back at the house. I just wanted to get as far away from there as possible. As I drove back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man and the woman following me. The road seemed longer on the way back, and every shadow looked like it was hiding something. When I finally reached town, I parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just a strange, creepy experience. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong with that house in the forest. I never took another delivery to that area again. The memory of that night still haunts me, and sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still feel their eyes watching me. I love babysitting. I've always enjoyed spending time with kids, playing games, and telling them stories. So when the Smiths asked me to babysit their baby boy, Jake, I happily agreed. The Smiths were nice people, and their house was cozy and warm. It was a good way to spend my Saturday evening. I arrived at their house around 6 p.m. Mrs. Smith showed me around, reminding me of where things were, and gave me the usual instructions. Feed Jake dinner at 7, play with him for a while, and put him to bed by 8:30. After that, I could watch TV or read until they got back. They expected to be home by 11 p.m. Jake was a happy baby. He giggled and played with his toys while I fed him dinner. After he finished eating, we played in the living room. Jake had a small train set, and he loved watching the little engine go around the tracks. His laughter filled the room, making me smile. At 8:15, I decided it was time to get Jake ready for bed. I carried him upstairs to his room. The nursery was painted in soft blue colors, with pictures of animals on the walls. A small nightlight in the shape of a star glowed gently in the corner. I placed Jake in his crib, and he looked up at me with his big, innocent eyes. "Good night, Jake," I said softly, tucking him in. He smiled at me, and I turned to leave the room. Just as I reached the door, Jake spoke. "Who's the lady on the ceiling?" My heart skipped a beat. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the ceiling. There was nothing there, just the plain white ceiling. I looked back at Jake, who was still smiling up at me. "There's no one there, Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But I felt a shiver run down my spine. Jake continued to stare at the ceiling, his smile fading a little. Feeling uneasy, I quickly left the room and closed the door behind me. I stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to calm myself. It was just a baby's imagination, I told myself. Kids say strange things all the time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went downstairs and turned on all the lights. The living room felt safe and warm. I turned on the TV and tried to find something to distract myself. A funny movie was playing, so I decided to watch it. I kept glancing at the baby monitor, listening for any sounds from Jake's room, but everything was quiet. After a while, I picked up a book from the coffee table. It was one of Mrs. Smith's mystery novels. I tried to get into the story, but my mind kept wandering back to what Jake had said. "Who's the lady on the ceiling?" It echoed in my head, making me feel uneasy. I forced myself to focus on the book, trying to ignore the creepy feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. The hours passed slowly. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I kept checking the baby monitor to make sure Jake was still asleep. Finally, at 11 p.m., I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. The Smiths were home. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. When they walked in, I greeted them with a smile, trying to hide my anxiety. "How was everything?" Mrs. Smith asked. "Everything was fine," I replied, not wanting to worry her. "Jake is asleep." They thanked me and paid me for the evening. As I walked home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The strange feeling stayed with me, making me feel uneasy. I decided I would not babysit at the Smiths' house again. The next morning, I got a call from Mrs. Smith. She thanked me again for babysitting and said Jake had slept through the night without any problems. I didn't mention what Jake had said about the lady on the ceiling. It seemed best to leave it alone. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I get chills. I can still hear Jake's innocent voice asking about the lady on the ceiling. I never found out what he saw, and I never went back to the Smiths' house. Babysitting is fun, but some experiences are just too creepy to forget. From that day on, I was more careful about the jobs I took. I always made sure to ask a few extra questions about the house and the kids. It's better to be safe than to end up in another scary situation. But no matter how many years go by, I'll never forget that night with Jake and the lady on the ceiling. I have always loved traveling. Seeing new places, meeting new people, and staying in unique accommodations were my passions. So when I found a charming old house listed on Airbnb, I booked it without hesitation. It was a large Victorian-style home in a small, quiet town. The price was cheap, and the pictures showed a cozy, well-kept place with antique furniture and a lovely garden. I arrived on a chilly Friday evening. The house was even more beautiful in person. Its white walls and dark wooden beams gave it a timeless look. The garden was filled with flowers, even in the late autumn weather. I rang the doorbell and was greeted by the host, Mrs. Mark, a sweet elderly lady with kind eyes and a warm smile. She showed me around the house, explaining the rules and pointing out the amenities. Everything seemed perfect. After settling into my room, I decided to explore the house. The living room had a large fireplace, and the kitchen was stocked with everything I might need. There was a long hallway with several doors leading to different rooms. Mrs. Mark mentioned that some areas were off-limits, like the basement. "It's old and dusty down there," she said. "Not much to see." That first night, I slept well. The bed was soft, and the room was quiet. But the next day, something strange happened. As I was having breakfast, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like a faint, muffled cry. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the old house settling, or perhaps a cat outside. But the noise continued, growing louder and more desperate. Curiosity got the better of me. I went to the basement door and pressed my ear against it. The crying was coming from inside. I knocked lightly, but there was no response. I tried the door, but it was locked. I felt a chill run down my spine. I found Mrs. Mark in the garden, tending to her flowers. "Excuse me, Mrs. Mark," I said, trying to sound casual. "I heard some noises coming from the basement. Is everything all right down there?" She looked at me with a strange expression. "Oh, that must be the wind," she said quickly. "This old house makes all sorts of noises." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to press her. Instead, I decided to investigate on my own. That evening, after Mrs. Mark went to bed, I took a flashlight and quietly made my way to the basement door. The crying had started again, more desperate than before. I searched the house for a key and eventually found one in a drawer in the kitchen. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door. The basement was dark and cold. The air smelled musty and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. I followed the sound of the crying, my heart pounding in my chest. At the far end of the basement, I found a small, makeshift room. Inside, sitting on a dirty mattress, was a man. He looked thin and frail, with a long beard and sad eyes. His clothes were tattered, and he shivered in the cold. "Help me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Please help me." I was shocked. "Who are you?" I asked. "What are you doing here?" "My name is Tom," he said. "I used to be a tenant here, but I lost my job and couldn't pay the rent. Mrs. Mark said she would help me, but she locked me down here instead. Please help me get out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could this sweet old lady do something so cruel? I knew I had to help him. I gave Tom some of my food and a blanket. "I'll find a way to get you out," I promised. The next day, I tried to confront Mrs. Mark, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the house, but found no sign of her. I called the police and explained the situation. They arrived quickly and searched the house. When they entered the basement, they found Tom, just as I had left him. Mrs. Mark was found later that day in the nearby woods. She had been living a double life, posing as a kind old lady while keeping Tom prisoner in her basement. The police took her into custody, and Tom was taken to a hospital. He was weak and malnourished, but grateful to be free. The whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how close I had come to staying in a house with such a dark secret. I left the town the next day, eager to put the whole ordeal behind me. But I will never forget Tom's haunted eyes and the sound of his desperate cries. From then on, I was more careful about the places I stayed and the people I trusted. The world is full of surprises, and not all of them are good. I had learned that lesson the hard way. It was a cold, quiet night at the gas station where I worked. The clock on the wall showed 1:45 a.m., and the only sounds were the hum of the coolers and the occasional car passing by on the empty road. I was sitting behind the counter, trying to keep myself awake by reading a magazine. The gas station was always slow at this hour, and I was looking forward to the end of my shift at 3 a.m. Suddenly, the chime above the door rang, announcing the arrival of a customer. I looked up and saw a man walk in. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, casting a shadow over his face. Something about him made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he moved, so deliberate and slow, or the way he seemed to be looking around the store with too much interest. He walked up to the counter and asked for a pack of cigarettes. His voice was low and raspy, sending a shiver down my spine. I reached behind me and grabbed a pack, placing it on the counter in front of him. He didn't pick it up right away. Instead, he pulled out a crumpled $10 bill from his pocket and handed it to me. As I took the money, our hands briefly touched, and I felt a jolt of cold run through me. I rang up the purchase and gave him his change, which he stuffed into his pocket without counting. He picked up the cigarettes and then, as if remembering something, asked if he could also get some gas. I nodded and asked how much he wanted. "Just $20, he said. I punched the amount into the register and handed him a receipt. "Thanks," he said, still in that unsettling voice. He turned and walked out of the store without another word. I watched him through the window as he filled up his old, beat-up car. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just encountered someone dangerous. After he drove away, I tried to go back to my magazine, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to that man and the strange feeling he had left me with. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back. The rest of my shift dragged on slowly, and when my relief finally arrived, I was more than ready to go home. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a news alert from the local station. I groggily picked up my phone and saw the headline, "Gas station robbed, attendant brutally assaulted." My heart started pounding as I read the article. The robbery had happened just an hour after my shift ended, at a gas station only a few miles away from where I worked. The description of the suspect matched the man who had come into my store. Tall, thin, wearing a dark hoodie. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized how close I had come to danger. The news report said the attendant had been badly beaten and was in critical condition at the hospital. The suspect had taken all the money from the register and had disappeared into the night. The police were asking for any information that might help catch him. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying my encounter with the man over and over in my mind. I kept thinking about the way he had looked at me, the cold touch of his hand, and the unsettling feeling he had left me with. I wondered if he had been planning to rob my gas station too, but had changed his mind for some reason. Maybe he had been scoping out different places, looking for the right moment to strike. That night, I had to go back to work, but I was more nervous than I had ever been. Every time the door chime rang, I jumped, expecting to see that sinister stranger again. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I kept imagining what might have happened if he had decided to rob my store instead. A few days later, I saw his face again, this time on the front page of the local newspaper. The police had caught him after he tried to rob another gas station. He had been involved in a high-speed chase and had crashed his car, ending up in the hospital with serious injuries. The photo showed his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were cold and empty, and there was a twisted smile on his lips that sent a shiver down my spine. As I looked at the picture, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Relief that he had been caught, fear at how close I had come to be one of his victims, and a lingering unease that I couldn't quite shake. The memory of that night, and the sinister stranger who had come into my store, would stay with me for a long time. Working at the gas station was never the same after that. I was always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, and always wary of late-night customers. The world seemed a little darker, a little more dangerous, and I couldn't help but feel that a part of my innocence had been lost forever. A few years ago, I worked as a pizza delivery driver. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills. One night, I had a delivery to a house on the other side of town. It was a football night, and the streets were busier than usual. The order seemed pretty standard. A large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese and a side of garlic bread. I remember that night clearly. The weather was cold, and a drizzle had started just as I got into my car. I put the pizza on the seat beside me and started the engine. The radio was playing some old rock songs, which I liked. I drove carefully, watching the road through the misted-up windshield. It was a bit past the promised delivery time when I arrived at the address, but only by a few minutes. I parked the car and grabbed the pizza. The house was dark, which seemed odd since they had ordered food. I walked up to the front door and knocked. There was a long pause before the door creaked open slightly. A man looked out, his face half hidden in the shadow. "You're late," he said in a gruff voice. I checked my watch. "Only by a few minutes," I replied, trying to stay polite. "Sorry about that. It's $18.50. The door opened wider, and I saw there were 3 other men behind him. They all looked rough and intimidating. I suddenly felt very uneasy. The first man stepped forward, and before I knew what was happening, he grabbed my shirt and pulled me inside. "Hey," I yelled, but my voice sounded weak and scared. They pushed me against the wall. The man who had pulled me inside now had a knife in his hand. He pressed it against my neck, just hard enough to make me freeze in terror. "Give us your money," he demanded. My heart was pounding. I reached into my pocket and handed over the money I had earned from the night's deliveries. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The man with the knife grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Is that all?" he asked. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He stepped back, still holding the knife, and the other men closed in, checking my pockets for anything else of value. They found my phone and took it too. "Please," I managed to say, "just let me go. I won't tell anyone." They laughed. One of them slapped me on the back, hard enough to hurt. "Sure you won't," he said sarcastically. I don't know how long they kept me there, taunting me, but it felt like forever. Eventually, they seemed to lose interest. The man with the knife looked at me one last time. "Get out of here," he said, and I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled out of the house and ran to my car. My hands were shaking so much that I had trouble getting the keys into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I sped away, not looking back. When I got back to the pizza place, I told my boss what had happened. He called the police, and I gave them a description of the men and the house. The police took my statement and said they would look into it. For the next few days, I was on edge, jumping at every little noise. But a week later, the police called me. They had caught the men. It turned out they were known for causing trouble in the area. I was asked to come down to the station to identify them, which I did. They were the same men who had robbed me. A few months later, I got a call from the police again. They told me that the men had been found guilty and were going to prison. They also said they had recovered some of my money and asked if I could come by to pick it up. I went to the station and was handed an envelope with my earnings inside. It wasn't a lot, but it felt good to get it back. More importantly, I felt a sense of closure. Those men were off the streets, and I could go back to my life without that constant fear. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was in bed one night, feeling tired from a long day at work. My eyes were getting heavy, and I was ready to fall asleep. The room was dark, with only a sliver of moonlight coming through the curtains. The quietness of the house was comforting. I lived with two housemates, Sarah and Henry, but they were both out for the night. Sarah had gone to visit her parents, and Henry was at his girlfriend's place. I was looking forward to having the house all to myself. As I was drifting off, I heard a soft creak from the hallway. My bedroom door was slightly open, and I saw a shadow moving. I figured it was just one of my housemates coming back early. But then something strange happened. The door slowly opened wider, and a head popped in. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of a person. They looked at me for a moment, and then quickly pulled back and shut the door. I was more annoyed than scared. They didn't even knock. I decided to get up and see who it was. Maybe Sarah or Henry had forgotten something and came back. I turned on my bedside lamp, which cast a warm glow in the room, and walked to the door. When I stepped into the hallway, it was completely silent. The house felt empty. I called out, "Sarah? Henry," but there was no answer. I checked the living room and the kitchen. The lights were off, and there was no sign of anyone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Where had they gone? I went back to my room and grabbed my phone. I texted Sarah first, "Hey, are you home? I thought I saw you." A few minutes passed with no reply. Then I texted Henry, "Are you here? I think I saw someone." Again, no response. I started to feel uneasy. I decided to check the front door. It was locked, just as I had left it. I went to the back door, which was also locked. My mind was racing. If both doors were locked, how did anyone get in? I walked back to the hallway, feeling more nervous with each step. I stood in the hallway, looking around, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe I had imagined it. I was tired, and my mind could have been playing tricks on me. But it felt so real. I decided to check every room, just to be sure. I started with Sarah's room. The door was closed, and when I opened it, everything was in its place. Her bed was made, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I moved on to Henry's room. His door was also closed. I opened it and saw his usual mess of clothes and books, but nothing that suggested someone had been there recently. Feeling more anxious, I checked the bathroom and the small storage room. Both were empty. I was starting to doubt myself. Maybe it was just a shadow or my imagination. I went back to my room and sat on the bed. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again, a soft creak coming from the hallway. My heart started to race. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I turned off my bedside lamp and listened carefully. The house was so quiet that I could hear my breathing. The creaking sound grew louder, like someone was slowly walking down the hallway. I wanted to get up and check, but fear kept me frozen in place. Suddenly, the door to my room opened slightly, just like before. I could see the shadow of a person standing there. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I pointed it at the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I felt a knot in my stomach. Something was very wrong. I decided to call Sarah. I needed to hear her voice. I dialed her number and waited, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried Henry next. The phone rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. I left a message, my voice shaking. "Henry, if you get this, please call me. I think someone's in the house." I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to call the police and look foolish if it turned out to be nothing. But I also didn't want to stay in the house alone. I decided to wait in my room with the door locked. I pushed a chair against the door for good measure and sat on my bed, holding my phone tightly. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, listening to every little noise. I kept the flashlight on, pointing it at the door. I kept thinking about the head I saw, the way it looked at me, and then disappeared. Who was it? What did they want? Finally, I heard a familiar sound, the front door unlocking. I jumped up, my heart pounding. I heard Henry's voice calling out. Relief washed over me as I rushed to the door, moving the chair aside and opening it. I found Henry standing in the hallway, looking confused. "What's going on?" he asked. I told him everything about the head, the sounds, and how scared I was. Henry listened carefully, then checked the house again with me. We found nothing unusual, no signs of anyone else being there. "Maybe it was just your imagination," Henry said, trying to reassure me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Even after Henry went to his room and I tried to go back to sleep, I kept hearing those creaks and seeing that shadow in my mind. I never found out who or what it was that night. But from then on, I always made sure to lock my door and keep a light on.